Hey, AP World History Scholars. I'm Miss Ziegler, the Time Machine teacher, and this is 3 weeks. That's right, 3 weeks before the AP exam. We're going to be talking about period 5 today, and I'm so excited because we are so close to being ready for the AP exam. Are you excited? You should be getting there. All right, so before we get started, make sure you download the directions below from the Google form so that you know what you're doing and you can take some notes on this video. Let's get started. Period 5 starts in 1750. However, let's back up a little bit and give yourself a little bit of context. We know you like context of the revolutions because that's the first topic we're going to talk about. So in the 1730s, we see that the Safavid dynasty completely collapses. The Mughal dynasty is fragmented. There's upheaval in China with several peasant rebellions. There's also some upheaval in Russia with peasant rebellions. The Wahhabi movement seriously threatens the Ottoman Empire, and there's also rebellions going on in Africa. So the North American revolutions and the European revolutions are happening on a much broader scale of all of this upheaval throughout the world. They're still based around having these expensive wars and governments that are struggling, as well as commercial relationships that are struggling. These costly wars force the Europeans to have to raise the taxes on their colonies, and that's going to lead to revolutions. We know about how the American Revolution starts because the colonists felt like they had no representation in Parliament and their taxes were too high, and that was because of the 7 Years' War that the British had to raise those taxes. The French are also raising taxes on their colonies to help pay for that 7 Years' War as well. The American, French, and Haitian Revolution are also very closely connected to each other through the people that are involved. For example, Thomas Jefferson spent some time in France. Beyond that, the revolution shared common ideas of freedom and governing themselves, independence, the ideas of liberty and equality, and questioning the divine rights of kings. All of these ideas were in these revolutions. Is it the way to go? Is this the way to be? Or should it be different? So that would be a really good similarity if you ever had to write an essay on this as to how these revolutions are related. Keep in mind that the documents for these revolutions are also very similar. The ideas that we see come from the Declaration of Independence are similar ideas that we see in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen during the French Revolution. Politically, in all the revolutions, we see this idea of popular sovereignty. Should people have the right to rule? And also social contract, which comes from John Locke, about this agreement between the government and the people and how the government should protect the people's rights and also protect the people as well. And remember, we said social contract is this agreement that you give up a little bit of your freedom in exchange for the government protecting you. Also, one difference between the revolutions in America, France, and Haiti is that Haiti is the first successful slave uprising. So in America and France, minorities didn't get many rights from these revolutions. That won't come until later. But in Haiti, slaves will earn their freedom. Also remember that these revolutions have an echo throughout the world. Other places in the world are now going to start questioning their governments, questioning women's rights, questioning who should have the right to vote, who should have equality, and abolishing slavery. We also know that these 3 revolutions are going to end very differently. In the case of the American Revolution, America starts their own government, their own constitution, completely breaks away from the mother country. So in the case of the French Revolution, after the Reign of Terror, Napoleon will take over, set himself up as monarch, and then start taking over Europe, where he spreads more of these ideas of revolution and his influence throughout Europe. Even though these seeds of change are being planted by Napoleon, the French dominance was looked down upon and resented by most Europeans, which will eventually start a more nationalistic viewpoint in Europe. The American and French Revolution both inspired the Haitian Revolution, as Haitian slaves who are suppressed by white landowners are thinking, wait a minute, why don't we deserve to have our rights too? This revolution will end in devastation for the small island. Since it's the first successful slave rebellion, it also echoes throughout the world as a hope for other places who own slaves. And it scares white slave owners and makes them think, are we next? Could we possibly have a revolution here? And so it's kind of like an inspiring revolution to other slaves throughout the world as they start to hear about what happened in Haiti. Then in 1810, we see the Latin American revolutions begin. Remember, Latin America is different in that there are several different classes of people in Latin America. You have the Creoles and the Mestizos, and it's very hard to unite Latin American countries. To solve this problem, those who were born in the Americas united under the term Americanos, and they saw all those born in Spain as the enemy. People of color had this grand promise of freedom and equality. However, most of these promises didn't come to be, especially for the lower class Native Americans and slaves. They benefited very little from independence. Most women didn't benefit either unless you were upper class. Also, the colonies of Latin America never really united the way that the United States did, so they were fighting independently. The results of the Latin American revolutions versus the American Revolution also flip-flop the economic situation in both of these areas. North America had been regarded as the backwater colonies and not very wealthy or good, whereas there was a lot of wealth in the Spanish colonies. And after the Revolution, they kind of flip-flop, where the American colonies progress into a new country and all unite, and the Spanish colonies are left in devastation and poverty. Echoes of all of these revolutions will eventually abolish slavery, start nationalism as a movement in Europe, and also lead to feminist movements, which will eventually result in women getting the right to vote. Woo! So there you have it. There's some similarities and differences between the revolutions in period 5. Let's move on to our next topic. The Enlightenment also influences another revolution. This one is economic. It's the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution changes how we use energy to produce, and it becomes easier and more efficient to make products. Therefore, manufacturers can make more money. We also have some new scientific innovations and improved agriculture, more trade, increased transportation. All of these things lead to the Industrial Revolution. Another thing to note about the Industrial Revolution is that it happens over time. It doesn't just happen one day and it's done. It changes throughout time. So agriculturally, we have the 3-field rotation, which makes it more efficient to grow crops. And as I said before, the enclosure movement, which leads to urbanization. The Industrial Revolution starts in Britain, primarily because they have a lot of coal. So for them, it was just geography that enabled them to have this awesome natural resource in order to start the Industrial Revolution. Some of the inventions that we talked about in period 5, the spinning jenny, the cotton gin, the steam engine, all of these inventions are very important in the Industrial Revolution. We also have increased productivity. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, there were cottage industries where people would make what they needed at home instead of in a factory. In class, we talked about the benefits of cottage industry, of how most of the time things were higher quality, because it takes more time to make them. They're more handcrafted. But when we move to the factory end of things, we have what's called, eventually, interchangeable parts, where if one part breaks on your item, you don't need to replace the whole thing, because in cottage industry, you didn't have parts that went together. It was all made one at a time. Eventually, in the factory setting, you'll have things that are going to be interchangeable, and that will definitely increase productivity. However, it doesn't always increase the quality of the item. The other downfall with factory is that it's going to be longer hours on a set clock. They're not going to be paid as much. So health factors into this, because health is not going to be as good in the city. Very cramped living in the city. So you also have that to take into account. And it's not safe. Most of the factories are very poor working environments. We have child labor going on, as young as 3 and 4 climbing into these machines and getting hurt. Women's dresses getting caught up in the machines and getting hurt. So the safety factors are definitely a problem during this time frame. We do have increased transportation, which will make it faster to get goods from one place to another and therefore make more money for the manufacturers. Out of the Industrial Revolution, we see capitalism form. This is through Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations. He basically says that mercantilism can never produce a good economy because economies should be based on human self-interest and making profits for yourself. He thinks that goods should be based on a supply and demand. If the supply is up and the demand is low, then why do we have that product? But if the demand is high and the supply is low, then more people will be willing to pay more money because they really, really want that product. He also argues that individuals should be able to compete in this economic society. The competition will then lower the prices as well as create better lifestyles for people. They should be able to sell within their nations as well as outside of their nations. And they should be able to invest in new innovations. He also argued laissez-faire capitalism, which means that government should have very little involvement in the economy. One of the believers in this is named David Ricardo. He comes up with what's called the comparative advantage theory, where he says there should be free trade among nations. He says that everyone would benefit from this. Consumers would benefit from more competition and lower prices, and it would force mass production from manufacturers, which would keep them in business. And foreign markets would also benefit because they would have other markets to sell their goods. So we see those as positives coming from the Industrial Revolution. We also have negatives. And we've talked about those a little bit. Let's just review them real quick. The division of classes is definitely a big negative. We start to see a bigger gap between rich and poor. Poor living and working environments in the factories and in the cities, such as in child labor and dangerous working conditions for women. Laborers were definitely underpaid and houses were very cramped at the time. Miners suffered from black lung disease. Poor working conditions lead to the establishment of labor unions as well as socialism. Labor unions form as a way of protecting the workers. If they didn't like what was going on, they could go on strike and demand better working conditions from the owners of the factories. Socialists wanted there to be less competition and therefore benefit the people through that. Out of the socialist movement, we see Marxist socialism come through. He wanted to create this utopian society where everyone had equality, everyone had enough to survive, and there wouldn't be any need for competition. He identifies two major groups, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie are the factory owners, while the proletariat are the workers. The bourgeoisie were out to exploit the proletarian, and the proletariat should revolt against that and change the society. Once that revolution was over, they would want to form a new society under communism, where everyone had equality. The suffragette movement also comes from the Industrial Revolution as women start to fight for the right to vote even more and for their rights in the factories. In the late 1800s, we also see another important invention, electricity. That's right. That makes your cell phones possible, people. So you better be grateful for electricity, because I know how much your generation loves your cell phone. This is also the time when Henry Ford creates the assembly line, and we see the use of interchangeable parts start to come in a little bit more, as I was talking about before. And medicine also improves during this time. On to our next topic, imperialism. We just recently covered this, so it should be fresh in your mind, but let's review it real quick anyway. Remember, imperialism is when a foreign dominating country goes in and takes over a smaller country and basically takes the resources from that country in exchange for making the country better, or saying they're going to make the country better by building infrastructure and helping that country. However, we know that most of the time it plays out a little bit differently, where the people in the imperialized country suffer at the hands of the imperializer, which is very unfortunate. We also know that it's mostly the European countries going to other parts of the world, building their massive empires. Remember, we said that the British Empire was so big that at one time you could say that the sun never sets in the British Empire, meaning that somewhere in the world there's a part of the British Empire that is still daylight. Industrialization leads to imperialism because the factories need raw materials to produce. So this causes huge competition between the industrialized countries to go and get those resources. As a result of industrialization, Europeans get an even more superior attitude when it comes to the minorities, which also leads to imperialism in a greater way. Because they're kind of saying, hey, this is our job to go in and help these people who cannot help themselves. Remember White Man's Burden, the poem we read? That's that, the white man's burden. That burden upon the back of the white man to go in and help these poor, unfortunate souls. At least that's how they justify it. The Industrial Revolution also makes this possible because of increased weaponry. For example, the Maxim gun. That does a lot of damage in Africa, as well as India in the 19th century. Improved medicine helps Europeans survive malaria, which they couldn't do before, as well as improved transportation such as steamboats and railroads opened new parts of Africa and India to be accessed by the Europeans. So there's this huge conflict over Africa, who should get what. And that's when we know they get together for the Berlin Conference under Otto von Bismarck, and they basically divide up Africa, saying which European country should take which part of Africa. Remember, this is going to cause problems in the long run too, because they don't take into account the different tribes. They form territories based on resources, not on where the tribes are. So some tribes that were put together had been enemies for centuries before, and now all of a sudden they're forced to get along side by side under these imperializing powers. It wasn't easy in all parts of the world, though, for Europeans to imperialize, specifically in China. China was very resistant. When the British sent an ambassador, he was very humble as he approached the Chinese court under the Qing dynasty. However, after he kowtowed and asked to trade, he was promptly thrown out of court. They got rid of him. In the late 1830s, we know that the British sold opium to the Chinese. This is going to cause a huge problem because now the people are wanting that more, since it's very addictive, than they are wanting to work. So the Chinese government outlaws opium. We know this causes a huge problem because the British are then sending it in illegally and will eventually lead to the Opium Wars between the British and the Chinese. The Opium Wars ends with the Treaty of Nanjing, where the Chinese have to allow the British in and they have to open up more ports for the British. Basically, the British have forced the Chinese into submission. Japan is also very resistant to trade. They were very isolated, and then Commodore Matthew Perry is sent in to ask for the United States to be able to come in and trade with them. Not Matthew Perry from Friends. He's my favorite Matthew Perry. No, Commodore Matthew Perry. Eventually, the U.S. does influence Japan to join the global trade. You remember, imperialism plays out a little bit differently based on where you're at. In Africa and India, it was more about getting the raw resources. In Asia, it was more about trade and economically imperializing. There were several different reactions to imperialism depending on where you were located in the world. In China, they started what was called the self-strengthening movement, where the Qing dynasty attempted to modernize China in order to compete with the Western governments. However, Confucian leaders did not like this, and this made the agriculture in China and the military a lot weaker, which will eventually be their downfall. In Japan, there was the Meiji Restoration, where new Western technologies and ideas are adopted by the Japanese and the shogun is thrown out. The daimyo, or the landowners, will eventually move into the city where the Japanese emperor gives them roles in government. The Japanese build industry through their new parliament, who assists the emperor, but they still retain some of their traditional social hierarchy. The Japanese parliament will use the money made from taxes to create a better navy and invest in manufacturing. Japan will then win a war against China as well as Russia and gain more Asian territory. These are called the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese Wars. Latin America will try to modernize through local culture. The hope was to eventually create Central America and Southern America in the same way that the United States had been created. However, Latin America could never get past their ethnic and social divisions, and so this didn't work. Because of military families having control over the land, this will eventually lead to military dictatorships in some of the nations. India is a little bit different as well, as theirs is more of an ethnic revolution. The Indian National Congress is formed in order to try to give equal treatment to all Indians as well as to govern themselves. However, the Indian National Congress was divided based on religion, Muslims and Hindu. Gandhi will start his independence movement in the early 20th century as a result of trying to unify India through the Indian National Congress. There are also problems in the Ottoman Empire due to several ethnic groups coming under the umbrella of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turks will eventually try to reform under the Young Turks, who would take the power from the Sultan. They stressed to have more rights for minority, a secular government, and the importance of education. It appeared that they wanted to modernize. However, they joined World War I under the Germans. And when there's a possible threat of Russian invasion, they blame the Armenians, which sets the stage for the Armenian genocide against the Armenian Christians. And eventually, the Ottoman Empire will collapse. So there's a lot in period 5 that is good to know. It might be a good idea to go back over your textbook and look at some of the concepts there, because you'll get a little bit more in-depth information. You can also look at your period 5 notes from your textbook reading. A little recap for you over period 5. Industrial Revolution is a big player in this period because it improves weaponry, medicine, science, travel, all of these things, which will eventually lead to imperialism, which is also a big player in period 5. The negative impacts of imperialism upon the natives. Economic systems begin to change. It's where we see capitalism and communism, and the shift in gender roles as women start to fight for their rights even more. All right, and that wraps up period 5. And make sure you do the rest of the amazing review Race to a 5. Thank you so much for listening, and if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure and do that and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss a thing. The Industrial Revolution, so for them, it was just